tonight's lecture does relate to my recent book on the Civil War, specifically how people imagined the Civil War before it happened, and then how their anticipations or expectations of the conflict shaped the way they understood it and acted during it. This lecture is going to try to convey two ideas to you, so I'll deliver them up front. First, visions of the future, like memories of the past, are socially constructed. We cannot reach the future or the past, so we imagine them. It's part of our imagination. Because historians are trained to look backward, our profession focuses on memories instead of anticipations. It's our natural gaze. But, and this is the second point for tonight, I believe that forecasts are more powerful than historical memories. Forecasting precedes history and shapes unfolding events. So how a society interprets news and acts in the present often depends on its expectations of the future. To support these claims, in this book, I decided to study the forecasts of America's most remembered and memorialized event. So Civil War historians kind of focus on the memory of the conflict instead of its anticipations. And in the lecture tonight, I hope to show you how Americans anticipated and dreaded the conflict, and then how their imagined futures shaped the war itself. This might sound really theoretical, talking about histories of futures past, but I'm a storyteller by nature. If you want to get into the theory of this, we can do that in the Q&A, but I promise to talk more in a storytelling style. We'll begin with this guy. While his comrades in the Richmond Howitzers anticipated battle, Thompson Brown expected to die. Amid the excitement and whirl of preparations, Brown sat down to write his wife goodbye. He tried to express his love for her and asked her to take care of his mother. Looking to the future, he worried, "I hope I died a true Christian." Rumors spread that the enemy was planning a night assault and the howitzers had patrol duty from midnight to dawn. When Brown imagined the future, he saw his company ambushed by Northern gunmen. The crack of rifle fire would wake comrades in camp who were ordered to sleep beside their arms. But friends would arrive too late for the howitzers, who would be far away in the dark where the enemy waited for them. Civil War archives preserve similar premonitions, letters penned by men who sensed that this one in particular would be their last. But none of those letters precede Brown's letter, which was written on November 27, 1859. You see, Thompson Brown guarded Harper's Ferry from a northern invasion to rescue John Brown from the gallows. As execution day loomed, Virginians tensed for another attack. The colonel of the local militia telegraphed the state pleading for reinforcements. In minutes, electric current transferred this man's anxiety across the entire state. The excitement pulsed through Richmond that night as the city's militia formed. They were anticipating orders for departure to the scene of action, as one of the men put it. Newspapers printed the colonel's call, sending his clamor to towns throughout the state not yet touched by telegraph lines. Preparing for the worst, Governor Henry Wise flooded the entire area with troops. Thousands of soldiers walked the streets and scoured the countryside day and night for weeks. The spectacle, as you can see, attracted gawkers who came to Harper's Ferry and Charlestown to witness history. Business stopped and people stood in their dooryards, swapping rumors and discussing the future. Nervous citizens noted that so many visitors had swarmed the town that the enemy, the abolitionists, might already have 1,000 secret agents walking the streets waiting for the signal to attack. Weeks. Oh, did I move forward one more? All right, we'll get to him in a minute. He can wait. Weeks of tense fears snapped on November 27th when people saw flares in the sky. Southerners who expected another raid explained the heavenly signs. Yankee rescuers in the surrounding mountains were coordinating their assault on the town. When mounted pickets stormed into the Howitzers' camp to report the blazing rockets, Thompson Brown picked up his pen and wrote his wife. The Civil War would begin with a Midnight Massacre in Western Virginia, and Thompson Brown was certain that he was going to be its first casualty. Edmund Ruffin wanted to believe those fires signaled the start of the Civil War. I wish that the abolitionists of the North may attempt a rescue, Ruffin confided in his diary on the night that Thompson Brown expected to die. Whether successful or not, a bloody rescue attempt would trigger disunion and civil war. Ruffin was there, watching rockets rise in the sky. But he knew they were an illusion. He understood the flares were in fact local sparks from nearby chimneys. Something small, insignificant, and low appeared large, portentous, and high because a dense layer of atmosphere bent rays of light from the sparks to create a superior mirage. This optical illusion refracted light beams and lifted them above their true position, making it feel like they were coming from the surrounding mountains. Antebellum Americans called this phenomenon looming, a term dubbed by sailors who often experienced this effect at sea, where refraction lifted land and ships into the sky. Superior mirages sparked seafaring legends like the Flying Dutchman. You didn't know you were going to get a physics lesson on optics tonight, did you? It's part of the title. Ruffin first experienced looming years earlier when he thought he spied a large, dark island in Chesapeake Bay. Had I not known that no such thing existed, Ruffin recalled, I should have guessed it to be a castle. Truth did not diminish the power of the illusion when someone informed Ruffin that he was in fact looking at a duck blind. At Harper's Ferry, when atmospheric conditions were right and people's imaginations were stirred, all that was needed to produce panic and dire visions of a looming civil war was a literal spark. So in this book, I use looming as a metaphor for how 19th century visions of the future formed, spread, and made history. First, some spark, an event or object, captured people's attention. Then, a unique atmosphere, the culture of the times, elevated and enlarged that spark, making it loom larger than reality. Finally, observers and visionaries focused on it and reported what appeared to be beyond the horizon. A series of sparks portended the American Civil War. Bleeding Kansas, the Panic of 1857, Harper's Ferry, Lincoln's election, and secession sparked prophecies, and these prophecies were, of course, of different civil wars. When thoughts of impending wars coalesced, they depicted diverse conflicts depending on the visionary's perspective. Looking west, Americans envisioned the Civil War as a border war for the frontier that would decide the direction of national ambitions. Looking east, Americans speculated about a civil war as a class war between competing labor systems that would shape the nation's economic prospects. Looking south, Americans spread rumors of a civil war that would spark racial extermination. And looking abroad, Americans prophesied about the Civil War as a revolution, a second American revolution that would be triggered by secession. When the real Civil War began, all of these visions shaped how Americans perceived the looming conflict and fought it. Somehow, the real war combined all of these antebellum prophecies without fulfilling any of them. How Americans understood time affected their visions of looming wars, and two prevailing temporalities coexisted in 19th century America. Before I explain their approach to time in their century, I want to do a quick experiment in the room. By a show of hands, how many of you imagine that the future is behind you? When you think of the future, how many of you think it's behind you? Nobody, right? Well, indigenous South Americans imagine the future is behind their head. The future's back here, because unlike the past, we cannot see the future or know anything about it. We're constantly blindsided by it. Now raise your hand if you think the future is ahead of you. Right? It's in front of us. Why? It's just time. Believing that the future is in front of us is a key metaphor that we live by, and it profoundly affects our history, culture, politics, science, and economy. Civil War Americans shared our view that the future was ahead of them, but they related to that future in different ways. Some people imagined themselves traveling through time toward the future and forging that future and their lives in the process. For these Americans, the future was open, opportunities abounded, and humanity made history. This modern temporality, which I define as anticipation, believes in progress and free will. You can see anticipation on the left there. The guy's got a telegraph in front of him. There's all kinds of signs of progress in that picture. Other people imagine themselves stationary, while time traveled through them. The future remained ahead, but instead of moving toward it, these people waited for the future to arrive with each passing day. Instead of focusing on an open future, these Americans often imagined a closed future that larger forces, impersonal and perhaps supernatural, had already determined. This older temporality, which I define as expectation, privileged providence and fate. Religion shaped how antebellum Americans imagined these futures. Millions of citizens believed that Jesus Christ's second coming would occur during their lifetime. In the 19th century, this was not what we would label a fringe faith. Beliefs about approaching the end of history colored how Americans envisioned territorial disputes, immigration, economic depressions, slave revolts, divisive politics, and of course, civil war. New technology also affected how these people understood time. The telegraph reinforced notions that humanity formed the center of the universe and affected eternity like a stone thrown into a pool. In 1850, Edward Hitchcock, the president of Amherst College, argued that all our thoughts are transmitted to every part of the universe through what he called a universal telegraph. Our thoughts are connected to the nervous system, there's electricity in this, our thoughts emanate everywhere. Hitchcock's friend, Theodore Parker, was the first to say that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And this is what he meant. He was talking about the universal telegraph. The universal telegraph, according to Hitchcock, preserves everything that we say, do, and think for eternity. And this is how God will judge all of our souls on Judgment Day, because all the material evidence is still out there in the cosmos. And according to Parker, when he's talking about the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice, what he's saying is that all of the goodness that we perform and think will materially reform, not just reform, but reform the cosmos over time. It's not a metaphor for him. Now, if the telegraph suggested the permanence of human action in the future and how cause and effect works, the railroad simulated time travel. Asa Whitney recorded his first experience on board a train in 1844. And I'll just preface this by letting you know, his train was going about 20 miles per hour, okay? Time and space are annihilated by steam. We pass through a city, a town, yea, a country, like an arrow from Jupiter's bow. Like the telegraph, the railroad focused people's attention on the future. The mind, he said, goes with all of this. It speculates, theorizes, and measures all things by locomotive speed. His day on the train gave Whitney new respect for religious groups that predicted humanity was approaching the apocalypse. So if the telegraph changed how people imagined cause and effect, the railroad gave people a sense that they were time travelers and that humanity and the world and the universe was heading toward the end of the line. Antebellum inventions favored anticipations over expectations and labeled them as masculine. Right, there's a gender component to this. Anticipations at the time were considered masculine. Women were supposed to wait for the future to arrive in the form of a marriage proposal or the birth of a child. Pregnant women were expected, not anticipated. Men molded the future with ambition and work. Masculinity in this era meant winning at what they called the race of life, which required a go-ahead attitude. This is a forgotten phrase today, but go-ahead was a 19th century American mantra. In 1859, Bartlett's dictionary defined go-ahead as rapidly advancing, progressive. Harnessing the ambition and power to move forward was what Americans sought and how they distinguished themselves from other people, especially Europeans. All of these changes marked modernity and strengthened faith that a single person or a small determined group could make history. When anticipation replaced expectation as the dominant temporality in antebellum America, it empowered some groups at the expense of others. Northern reformers, Western boosters, and Southern nationalists captured the temporal outlook of the times by taking matters into their own hands and shaping the future. These temporal changes also increased sectionalism by favoring radicals in both regions. In the North, abolitionists like John Brown, who advocated violence and political involvement, gained credibility over his colleagues in the reform movement, who preferred prayer and moral suasion. In the South, immediate secessionists like Edmund Ruffin urged disunion before the federal government attacked slavery and branded everyone who opposed them as submissionists. By 1860, social conservatives and political compromisers seemed literally out of step with the times. This wave of anticipation peaked with Abraham Lincoln's election, Deep South secession, and the war fever that followed Fort Sumter. Edmund Ruffin was so confident in secession and Confederate victory that he published a history of the Civil War in 1860. He titled this book Anticipations of the Future, in which he predicted, of course, Confederate independence, and he said it would be the result of Southern bravery, slave loyalty, and the failures of the North's free labor capitalism. When secessionist visions started to materialize in 1860, people convinced themselves that the prospects that loomed on the horizon were real and achievable. The mirage wraps you round, Lawrence Keat reported from the Confederate founding in Montgomery, Alabama. Sail on and you will meet the ship you saw in the air. We've been talking about Looming. Keat observed, forward is the inexorable word in this world. In 1861, after generations of worrying and dreaming about the Civil War, it finally came. And when it did, people and their visions of the future, they used these visions to read the news and make history. Forecasts of a 90-day war, vows that one recruit could whip 10 of the enemies, promises even to drink all the blood that would be spilled by secession. Such sentiments anticipated a short bloodless romantic war. These boasts also shared popular anticipations that people control the future, and whoever reached the war first would make history. Battlefields offered an open prospect and beckoned to men who had the foresight and courage to go ahead and be the first there. When the war came, Theodore Winthrop joined the 7th New York Infantry, a unit brimming with elite New Yorkers who shared his conviction that the path to victory was straight ahead. They wore gray uniforms with white cross belts and Bowie knives and enlisted for 30 days. The regiment was the first in the city to go off to war on April 19th, 1 week after the war started at Fort Sumter. The 7th tramped down Broadway under a bower of flags. Winthrop and the 7th answered Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers. Now, some historians have misinterpreted this call as proof that even Lincoln underestimated the scale of the war. When Lincoln asked for only 75,000 men, he followed the advice of General Winfield Scott, who anticipated that a massive muster of men would give the government more men than it could handle and provoke the Upper South to secede as well. Other scholars insist that Lincoln's call for 90-day enlistments illustrates his faith in a short war. This, too, is incorrect. Lincoln was a lawyer, and he understood a 1795 militia law limited the service term of volunteers to 30 days after the Assembly of Congress. Because Congress isn't in session back then, the president can only call out volunteers for that amount of time. So when Lincoln's proclamation for troops called Congress into a special session that was going to start on July 4th, that meant that most of these volunteers would serve about 90 days. To convene Congress earlier would shorten these volunteers' term of service. To wait and have Congress come in later would, of course, mean he wouldn't have a legislative branch to help him get ready and mobilize for war. So it was a tricky situation for Lincoln. When the 7th finished its term of service and mustered out, basically before the war even started, Winthrop transferred to Fort Monroe to serve as General Benjamin Butler's staff secretary. The move satisfied his eagerness to travel straight to the seat of war. "By liberty," he wrote his mother, "but it is worth something to be here at this moment, in the center of the center. Here we scheme the schemes. Here we take the secession flags, the arms, the prisoners. Here we liberate the slaves." Well, he said, virtually. Winthrop, of course, was anticipating events. None of these things had happened yet. His garrison had not captured flags, weapons, or prisoners. After he arrived at the fort, Winthrop convinced Butler to let him plan a surprise attack against nearby Confederates. His plan called for 2 regiments to coordinate separate marches at midnight, meet in front of the enemy's position at dawn, fire a single volley, and then charge them with bayonets. Winthrop's plan would have tested the abilities of veterans, and his army had never seen battle. When the 2 regiments met in the dark that night, they thought they were encountering the enemy and fired at each other. This mistake wounded 21 men and, of course, erased the element of surprise. After officers regained order, they huddled up and wanted to return back to the fort because their plan, of course, had been compromised. Winthrop convinced them to press forward. The march took longer than expected, and Confederates had hours to prepare for their arrival. When Winthrop and his men appeared at the Confederate position around noon the next day, a shower of rebel bullets welcomed them. Winthrop hid behind a fallen tree and told the soldier next to him that he would see the inside of that enemy trench before he returned to Fort Monroe. When ordered to retreat, Winthrop instead stood up on the log and urged the men to come on. A North Carolinian shot him through the chest. Theodore Winthrop's ability to march forward to the future ended yards from the Confederate With eerie irony, Winthrop had anticipated his death 10 years earlier in a poem he wrote. "Let me not waste in skirmishes my power," he said, "in petty struggles. Rather, in the hour of deadly conflict, may I nobly die, in my first battle perish gloriously." He was the first Civil War officer killed in battle. When Winthrop's men stumbled in the dark that night, they encountered a group of runaway slaves who asked which way it was to the Freedom Fort. Fort Monroe was an emancipation magnet years before Lincoln freed any slaves. In 1861, enslaved Americans who raced toward the war seeking freedom expressed anticipations of an open future that rewarded courage and enterprise. On May 23rd, the day that Edmund Ruffin and other white Virginians celebrated their state's ratification of secession, 3 enslaved men, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend, anticipated freedom and grasped it. While white Virginians toasted their entrance into the Confederacy, Baker, Mallory, and Townsend commandeered a boat and rowed 4 miles across the estuary to Fort Monroe. 12,000 Union soldiers garrisoned the old stronghold. Baker, Mallory, and Townsend had worked at Sewell's Point, digging artillery emplacements armed at the Yankee fort. Their master, Confederate Colonel Charles Mallory, sensed the danger of leaving them within sight of the enemy and told them he planned to take them to North Carolina, where they could work for the Confederate Army at a safer distance from Yankees. All 3 men had families in the area, and moving to another state held no appeal to them. Seeking a better future for themselves across the bay, they had no assurance that the Union Guards would allow them inside the fort. Rowing toward the Union pickets at night, the men risked being shot. Friends and family anxiously waited to see if Baker, Mallory, and Townsend returned. Soldiers in the fort asked the runaways if more were coming, and the black men said if they were not sent back, others would understand that they were among friends, and more would come the next day. Scores of slaves followed. "Such is the mysterious spiritual telegraph which runs through the slave population," a soldier observed. "Proclaim an edict of emancipation in the hearing of a single slave on the Potomac, and in a few days it will be known by his brethren on the Gulf of Mexico." Harry Jarvis heard the news and seized the chance to escape his master, who was known as the meanest man on the eastern shore. Conditions on the plantation deteriorated after the war came. The day his owner shot at him, Jarvis reckoned it was time to leave. Hunted by patrols and dogs for 3 weeks, Jarvis relied on friends for news and food while he hid in the woods. When his master posted men along the shoreline to catch him if he tried to escape to Fort Monroe, Jarvis waited until his master's birthday. "I knew they'd all be drinking and carousing night and day, and all the servants be kept home. So I took the opportunity to slip down to the shore at night, got a canoe and a sail, and started for Fort Monroe." Out on the water that night, a storm raged over his little boat, but Jarvis was not afraid. "It was death behind me, and I didn't know what was ahead. I just asked the Lord to take care of me, and by the wind went down to a good, steady breeze straight for Old Point." Jarvis arrived at Fort Monroe the next morning and told General Butler he wanted to enlist. Butler said, "It's not a black man's war." Jarvis told him it would be a black man's war before they got through. While Butler envisioned a short romantic war for the Union, Jarvis anticipated a long, destructive war that would require black soldiers and kill slavery in the process. Not content to labor for the federal government in exchange for food and shelter, Jarvis wanted a uniform, a rifle, and pay. The future could not arrive fast enough for him. When he saw a fugitive slave at Fort Monroe return to his master, Jarvis decided it was time to move on. He hired on a ship going to Cuba, and then on another one going to Africa, and was gone for 2 years. When he returned in 1863, his prophecy was fulfilled. The Union Army was enlisting African Americans, and Jarvis joined one of the first black regiments. When black Southerners, like Jarvis, raced to Union lines, they revealed something that most Americans had not anticipated about the looming war. The future would unfold where fugitive slaves met federal authorities, not simply where Union soldiers fought Confederate troops. Thousands of Americans shared Jarvis's vision of a long, destructive war. On April 11, 1861, this is the eve of the conflict, the night before Fort Sumter, Arthur Carpenter wished for a long, terrible struggle to restore the Republic's virtues. I believe that a war of 5 or 10 years would be a great thing, he said. It would purge our nation of some of its filth and deadheads, and then we should be ready to commence anew. A 20-year-old shoemaker's apprentice from Indiana, Carpenter imagined war as a contest that, in his words, exposed fops and light-brained scoundrels in high places, and replaced them with natural leaders, loyal men like him. South Carolinian Jesse Reed agreed. Big men seem willing to drink all the blood that will be spilled by this war, he noted, and I think they will have to be as big as they feel before they do so. Politicians will not be able to drink the whole bottle. Time will show. In Ohio, James Garfield, echoed Reed's predictions. He could see no possible end to the war. There can be no doubt, he said, that we are now entering upon a terrible and bloody war. Garfield, the future president, was prepared to sacrifice 1 million lives for the Union. When the war acquired its own momentum and killed thousands, hundreds of thousands, it undercut American confidence that individuals made history by anticipating events and fashioning the future. The destructive indecision of military campaigns challenged people's faith in progress. Facing uncertainty, some Americans hoped that God crafted the war and would provide a meaningful ending for it. Others doubted that the Almighty could ever be responsible for such carnage and waste. For doubters, the war defied all linear narratives toward either civilization or the millennium. Whatever fate awaited America, people sensed that the war's outcome would arrive in its own time, on its own terms, and no one could control it. Instead of anticipating a glorious war that would revitalize the nation, thousands expected a ruinous conflict that would spin out of control. When Fort Sumter fell, college student Andrew McCollum wrote, "There can be no doubt that the most destructive and bloody war has been inaugurated at Charleston. He predicted every citizen coming under the militia law will eventually have to go." Women from across the nation expressed dreadful predictions about the war's destruction and duration. Dante never saw more clearly the tortures of the damned than I have the possibilities of the future, Grace Elmore wrote. She imagined her brother dead on the battlefield, her mother shorn of wealth in old age, her family scattered. Untold thousands of women envisioned similar tragedies. But not everyone who expected the war sensed approaching death. Many people dreaded anarchy. Others feared a financial collapse. People who sympathized with the opposite region, like New York conservatives and Virginia Unionists, feared that warring parties dragged them and the nation into a senseless struggle. Others expected nothing specific, but felt a sickening feeling about the war and knew by premonition that it controlled their fate and their families' futures. All of these visions of looming war shared a dreadful feeling that the future rushed toward them and they were powerless to avoid it. Even people at the center of activity, like Abraham Lincoln's personal secretary, John Nicolay, confessed, events are crowding so thickly upon us that it is impossible to calculate their present or future importance. At different points in the conflict, all sorts of Americans felt this way, from generals and statesmen to common soldiers, from women at home to refugees on the road, from former slaves to Wall Street brokers. In June of 1861, Carrie Fries of North Carolina thought women's hardest struggle is after the excitement of preparation is over and they are left to await the future as best they can. Fries sewed uniforms for departing volunteers, but after the men left, she said, "The loneliness is really painful. You can form no idea of it." The day her brother and uncle left for war, Kate Stone sensed the weary days of watching and waiting that stretched before us. Stone understood that volunteers could anticipate the future, march toward it, and buoy their spirits with new scenery, excitement, and the satisfaction of performing a duty. The war compelled women who stayed behind to expect the future. Fate would come when either their men returned or news of their deaths arrived. Telegraph operators, this is one of them here, these two guys. Telegraph operators shared women's tortured position. When Washington requested the best operators that the Pennsylvania Railroad could spare, Andrew Carnegie personally escorted his 4 best men to the Capitol. One of them, David Homer Bates, that's him right here, recalled the stress of waiting for arriving dispatches. His title, operator, privileged the slim fraction of time he spent tapping messages on the machine. Listener was a more accurate description of his work. He and other operators spent endless hours straining to hear approaching news on their machine. Civil War expectations imprisoned Bates. At the start of the war, he worked at the Navy Yard near Washington, D.C. Authorities placed an armed sentry outside his door. He had a solitary office with his telegraph machine in it. No one was permitted to disturb the operator. These orders were obeyed literally, he said, and for 4 days I was a virtual prisoner. The guard passed meager meals to him. Bates waited and waited. Unable to stand it any longer, on the 5th day, he locked the door, opened a window, and escaped. When he returned, he unlocked the door, and the sentry appeared and said, "If you do that stunt again, I'll shoot you." The strain of waiting for the future to arrive took its toll on men in the telegraph office. The first manager of telegraph operations in the War Department, a man named John Strauss, worked himself to death. He began the war in poor health and did not last a year. The second superintendent resigned instead of facing the same fate. The third, Major Thomas Eckert, the man on the left, was a titan, a giant of a man physically and mentally. As a young man, he traveled from Ohio to New York City to see Samuel Morse's invention in person, and then built his own telegraph from memory when he returned home. When a War Department clerk bought cheap iron pokers, Eckert proved their inferiority by breaking them over his flexed forearm. Only men like Eckert survived in the telegraph office. Bursts of sound interrupted tense expectations when a telegram finally arrived over the wire. The message came one letter at a time, punctuated, of course, by dramatic pauses. As the operator transcribed the dispatch from Morse code to English, he capitalized words that he deemed important because the message did not appear in distinct thoughts and sentences. Instead of unfolding in order with syntax, the message appeared as a matrix of words with 5, 6, or even 7 columns and lines. These blocks of text included blind words, extra text intended to confuse enemy interceptors. And they also included a keyword in the message, which revealed the order and direction in which the matrix needed to be rewritten. What does this mean? This means the future arrived as nonsensical garbage, and the operators literally deciphered it. Even decoded messages, of course, contained a lot of uncertainty. The truncated prose of telegrams could torment the recipient. A telegraphic messenger woke Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. the night after the Battle of Antietam to announce, quote, this is the whole message, Captain Holmes, wounded, shot through the neck, thought not mortal, at Keedysville. The message haunted Holmes for days. Was his son's wound thought not mortal or not thought mortal, he wondered. As the doctor rumbled south on a train looking for his son, locomotion stirred thoughts about the wound. He's a medical doctor. This is what he wrote. Windpipe, food pipe, carotid, jugular, a great braid of nerves, spinal cord. A bullet through the neck ought to kill someone at once. For days, Holmes had only the same 12 words from the telegram to interpret his son's fate. Abraham Lincoln expected the future by temperament, and he haunted the telegraph office. Most days he left the White House, walked to the War Department, and sat at Major Eckert's desk, waiting for the future to arrive. I believe I feel trouble in the air before it comes, he told his aide, after spending a night in the telegraph office reading dispatches from the front. During the summer of 1862, he sat at Eckert's desk and wrote on foolscap. Like the operators, Lincoln wrote in short bursts and long pauses. Arriving telegrams interrupted his work, but the overall silence of the place provided a better writing space than the White House. Each night, Eckert locked Lincoln's writing in his desk drawer without reading it. Once while writing, Lincoln looked out the window and spotted a giant spider web between the windowsill and the portico. Eckert joked that the operators called the colony of spiders Major Eckert's lieutenants, and assured Lincoln that they would report soon. According to Bates, who was there, not long after, a big spider appeared at the crossroads and tapped several times on the strands, whereupon 5 or 6 others came out from different directions. So when Eckert and his men looked at the web, they clearly saw telegraph operators and wires transmitting messages. Lincoln did not share what he saw in the web. Maybe he saw the war with its web of contingencies touching everywhere and restricting everywhere. Perhaps he saw slavery and how it ensnared the nation. Sitting in the telegraph office that summer, writing for the future in 1862, Lincoln was composing the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it seems paradoxical that Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, attributed unfolding events to God or fate. If any individual could claim control of the war, it was the President of the United States. Yet, he explained, I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. When the war entered its 3rd year, the nation's condition, he said, is not what either party or any man devised or expected. God alone can claim it. Because he lived the time of expectancy, sensing how the future approached him like waves reaching a shore, Lincoln focused on external forces, invisible elements that affected people and made history. After the Civil War, Americans forgot what they expected. The broad antebellum horizon, with its diverse predictions, shrank in hindsight. Society replaced its complex visions of looming border wars, economic clashes, racial strife, revolutions, and the apocalypse, with a simple myth that claimed no one knew the war would be long and bloody. After the fact, Americans convinced themselves that everyone looked forward to a lark. According to this short war myth, the war would be a brief, bracing adventure that invigorated the nation. Before bloodshed, thousands of people did anticipate a romantic war, but thousands of others expected the worst. The short war myth overshadowed the dread that women felt. It also ignored the dire warnings of conservatives and bordermen who sensed the approaching destruction. And, perhaps most telling, it erased the hopes of millions of African Americans who prayed for a cataclysm to kill slavery. For many reasons, people's post-war memories differed from their antebellum forecasts of the conflict. The trauma, power, and duration of this event changed the world and how people viewed it. Understanding and expressing these changes must have been very difficult for survivors. I cannot believe I am the same person that was ever so lighthearted and hopeful in the future, wrote a widow in 1865. By focusing on the most mistaken predictions of 1861, people admitted that they did not know the future as well as they thought. Centering on the war's enthusiastic anticipators also privileged the perspectives of millions of young volunteers. The short war myth honored the heroism of recruits who marched to war as boys in 1861, and if they were lucky, returned home as men in 1865. The Civil War, in part because of the short war myth, becomes a coming-of-age story about the people who fought it and the nation that endured it. Beyond expressing the war's chasm between antebellum and post-war life, the short war myth appealed to Americans because, of course, it reconciled the North and the South. Neither side could be blamed for causing the war if everyone misread its portents. No one bore responsibility for its death and destruction if all expected a short, bloodless party. Evidence abounds that antebellum Americans imagined wars that exceeded the Civil War in power and duration. They imagined Armageddon. They forecasted racial extinction. They predicted revolutions bloodier than the French. And some of them even wished for these wars to purge America. The short war myth also prevails because of its seductive narrative. It ensures the deep, poetic structure of Civil War history. Ken Burns introduced the short war myth to millions of Americans in his documentary film. Bruce Catton used the short war myth to great effect in his popular Centennial History of the Civil War. This may or may not have been the end of America's golden age, Catton wrote, but it was at least the final haunted moment of its age of innocence. For African Americans, the Civil War ended an age of wickedness, not an age of innocence. Instead of anticipating a party when the war began, slaves expected an answer to their prayers. Recalling his life enslaved to the Brent family in Richmond, Thomas Johnson remembered anxiety, rumor, and biblical readings rippling through the black community as antebellum events unfolded. Despite learning to spell and write in secret, Johnson thought the door to freedom seemed as much closed as ever in the 1850s. A large map of the United States hung in his master's dining room. While cleaning the room, Johnson would study the names of every city along the rail line from Richmond to Boston. Often I wondered whether I would ever see these cities where all were free, he wrote. Freedom finally arrived when the Union Army entered Richmond on April 3rd, 1865. That scene of years ago comes up vividly before me at this moment, Johnson wrote at the turn of the century. Men and women wept and praised God. Black people danced in the streets, played instruments, climbed trees, yelled at the top of their lungs, and gave impromptu speeches to gathering crowds. The long night of affliction in the house of our bondage had passed, Johnson said. That deeply desired and hoped for and prayed for time had come. When Johnson remembered the Civil War, he explained its origins as a divine reckoning. The innocent blood of murdered men and women and children had cried unto God from the ground. And he, in his own time, which is always the right time and best time, and in his own way, which is always the very best way, answered that cry. Johnson often told people that he was born 3 times, in 1834 as a thing, mere child, in 1857 as a Christian, and in 1865 as a free man. People are not responsible for their own births. Johnson did not take credit for the events that defined his life. God and the future had blessed him. Thank you.